I bet many of you have heard of a game called the Callisto Protocol. You probably heard that the game was made by OG devs who made Dead Space, a classic in survival space horror, and that the game itself turned out to be quite the disappointment. It was by no means a bad game, but it didn't live up to the reputation of Dead Space, and that happened despite the fact that the game had been developed by so-called OG devs, who created amazing games that everyone loves to this day. Now, I'm bringing this up for a reason, because when we talk about Exodus, you also tend to talk about the OG devs. And the OG developer aspect was one of the first things I mentioned in my introduction video many months ago to the game of Exodus. And so I do think that OG developers carry some weight. They have a certain bona fides, if their track record has proven certain things in the past. In the case of Exodus, you have James Olin, the head of Archetype Entertainment. You have Chad Robertson, who is the second in command, who is involved in all the management. And then you have, of course, Drew Karpyshyn, who is the lead writer for the game. And in theory, when you mention these names, they should technically represent the promise of greatness. James Olin especially, as he's a guy who has created his own tabletop systems and games, in addition to games such as the original Baldur's Gate games, Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age Origins. These are big names, and they say a lot. But given the preponderance of the evidence from the past, the fact that we had games such as the Callisto Protocol, which didn't quite flop or were not nearly as good as they were being hyped up to be, you could always say that caution is warranted here. And indeed, I think caution is warranted. I'd say at this stage, I'm slightly less hyped than I was a few months ago. That's because time has set in, and we need to be realistic. I don't think that OG names are sufficient to guarantee quality and greatness. But I wanted to mention all of that as a preamble, a caveat, to let you know that, like you, I do have a bit of skepticism. I'm not all over this with total hype, and I also realize the fact that despite this game being made by OG BioWare developers, that does not act as a guarantee that it will be good. So let's get that out of the way. I've said it, and I agree with you. But there's some other aspects and elements to Exodus that really make it different, and really tell you that this is probably not going to be just another game. This is not just another game being made by a bunch of OG devs who are trying to rekindle the flame of old. And we have a lot of evidence for this. Most games are simply being developed, which means you have studios working on a game for a couple of years, and at some point in time, that game comes out. That is true of Exodus as well. But that is where the similarity ends. Exodus has a whole lot more going for it than just being a game, and the proof is in the pudding. Many of you might know about this by now, as I've talked about it on the channel, but Exodus has a book that's nearly 1,000 pages long that came out well before the game came out, because the game still isn't out, meant to serve as a primer for this universe and setting, and written by Peter Hamilton, one of the greats of modern science fiction. This is a book that is separate to the game, but nonetheless affords you a tremendous insight into the game, the universe, its politics, and the nature of the space opera that it will almost certainly be. And on top of that, Exodus is also receiving a tabletop RPG game so people can play it at home with pen and paper that was also created by James Olin, the mastermind behind Exodus. And ultimately, Exodus is James Olin's baby. This is a game he's always wanted to make. He's done a lot of work in fantasy, some work in science fiction, and he was about to quit the industry. And the only reason he stepped back into the industry was because he was allowed to make this game. I've said this before, but based on his statements, he has acquired a promise from Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro that they will not interfere in the development process of this game, meaning he has all the authority, he gives the directives, and he decides what makes it into the game or not. And that's a lot of power, but I trust him with it. So imagine that, a game that hasn't even come out yet, that's receiving its own tabletop RPG and has its own novel that's preceded the game. But it doesn't stop there, because the first novel is part of a duology, because there's going to be another novel written by Peter Hamilton that is going to arrive next year, probably just prior to the release of Exodus the game, that's going to be another 900 to 1,000 pages. But it also doesn't just stop there. If you go to the game's website, the Exodus website, you'll find a website that is chock-a-block full of lore, short stories, art, and explanations for the universe before the game has even come out. The short stories are very good. I recommend that you read them. And there's a whole bunch of lore on the website explaining the basic timeline of the universe. And on top of that, of course, you have a number of shorter lore videos that have come out on the Exodus channel explaining things like awakened animals, changelings, celestials, etc., etc. And most recently, of course, we got the first reveal of actual gameplay. So let me summarize that for you. You have 2 near 1,000-page novels coming out before the game. You have an entire website filled with history, lore, and short stories. You have an Exodus tabletop RPG that's coming out next year. And you have a whole bunch of lore videos on Exodus' YouTube channel explaining the actors and the characters of the game. And James Olin has gone on record as saying that this is but the beginning, meaning that Exodus, the first game, is the beginning of a very, very long commitment and involvement in this universe, which means you could easily imagine further games coming out after this initial Exodus game, more tabletop material, as well as other novels set in this universe written by other authors. That's basically what his ambition is and what he's aiming for. Now, I want you to think about something. If James Olin and his team were not incredibly, supremely confident that this game would be a success, why would they do all of this? Why would there be a tabletop RPG being released before the actual video game next year? Why would there be 2 novels of nearly 1,000 pages being written by one of the greatest science fiction authors of our time being released before the video game is released? Why would they have all those short stories written on the website before the video game is released? Why would you have an entire arsenal of lore, history, and a timeline on their website before the game is even released? That is not normal for a game developer. That's not normal for game development. Normally, they work on a game, they cook it, and eventually the game comes out, and that's it. Now, I will say, that's still not a guarantee that the game will be good, but you really have to think about it. These things that already have been released, and will be released before the actual video game is released, are unprecedented in the history of video games for an IP that is not unknown. We're not talking about Dungeons & Dragons, we're not talking about Warhammer, we're talking about a completely new IP. And in that sense, this has never been seen before. Why would they put the time, work, and effort into it? And above all, why would they spend the money, specifically Wizards of the Coast money and Hasbro's money, if they were not absolutely supremely confident that what they're working on is special and is almost certain to succeed? Now, of course, they could be delusional, and maybe I bought into the delusion. But the preponderance of evidence suggests otherwise. The preponderance of evidence, the fact that they've released so much material on the game without the game even being out yet, tells me that they know something that we don't know. And based on the lore, based on the books, based on the short stories, based on all the things we've seen so far, I think the game appears to be, thus far, based on the limited evidence, indeed something special. Am I still skeptical? Sure. There's one thing that bothers me tremendously, for example, and that is the character models, specifically the haircut of our female companion, Elise Cheroux, who has the ugliest neon pink purple bowl haircut I've ever seen in a game to date. That said, I am so far very impressed by the storytelling, the world building, and from what little I've seen of the combat. I think that Archetype Entertainment is cooking something special, and the fact that they've released so many things in this hitherto unseen manner is very telling. So take into account this conglomeration of facts and the weight of the evidence, and the fact that they wouldn't have done this, they wouldn't have put all this effort in and released all these things before the game is out if they were not tremendously confident about the project they're working on. They must really know something that we don't, and I would argue they've already given us hints as to why this game might be special. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in, and if you like my videos and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.